Random.
Okay, I started recording.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining us, Sunshine.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks for donating to our bingo. We're really excited to have bingo tonight.
I know. I'm excited to see how that goes.
Yeah.
I know, us too.
Katie, I don't know if she told you, but she had like a bingo party at her house before the holidays. So that was really great. So I'm sure that this will be good too.
Cool.
Yeah, as the impetus for the bingo.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
I want to start running an underground bingo hall, but there are a lot of bingo halls in Brooklyn, so I have to be careful of whose toes I step on.
Yeah, Katie, we're recording this. You can't. This is going to be used as evidence later.
I know.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks a lot for joining us, Sunshine, all the way from Helena, Montana.
Helena, yep.
And yeah, do you maybe just want to really briefly explain how you ended up in Helena? I think maybe.
Sure. Yes. So I think I originally came to Montana to do a residency at the Bray in the summer of I think 2011 maybe, and then that kind of got cut short because I got a teaching gig. So I went back to California. And it was kind of during the time where all of a sudden there was lots of economic crisis around education. And so those kind of jobs kind of evaporated. I kind of thought I would go into teaching at universities or that route. And then I decided after a year of doing that and having just struggling, I applied for the Bray to do a long-term residency. And so then I came back to do a long-term residency and just spent 2 years trying to figure out how to be kind of a entrepreneur, a potter. How do I become a studio potter in this day and age? I'd kind of thought I would go into education, and that just wasn't panning out. There were just no opportunities, or they were so few and so many people were applying for them. It was just really difficult, especially when you're really early stage in your career. So, and then after my residency, I decided to go back to California, and I had another sort of transitional kind of after the residency, okay, I'm going to transition into real life kind of idea. And so went to California, did a couple teaching gigs, and then started a studio and did all that sort of stuff. And, I kind of had a short list of places that I wanted to go. And Sacramento has kind of been my home base for a long time. I had a lot of friends there and things like that. But I ended up having kind of, after a couple years, just a little bit of a crisis in that I was really sad and really lonely. And sometimes, when you're a working artist, that's what you do with your time. And so you don't go out and socialize, you don't go make new friends. And I kind of realized that I had been that person in my friend group that I would drive to San Francisco to see people, or I'd drive to Napa, and I just no longer had the desire to travel like that because I was traveling so much in my professional life. I just wanted to be home. But that meant I had just one or two friends, and just wasn't I wasn't really happy. And so I was kind of thinking about how I wanted to move forward, and I decided that I wanted to move to some friend groups, basically. I think sometimes in Clay, we're all kind of scattered all over the country. And so I'm really lucky that a large number of my resident group ended up settling here. And so I've got 4 or 5 best friends that live here, which is amazing. And I just kind of missed that idea of having people over and watching dumb TV or having dinner parties. I just didn't have that much in my life when I was in Sacramento. So that's how I kind of ended up back in Helena last year. So it was either here or Portland, which is where my family is. And I decided it's one of those things when you're a family, you're always flying in to visit your family. The idea of moving there was a little bit daunting. I was like, that might be too much family. So, yeah. I kind of like to visit my family, not live necessarily with them. So.
And did you two meet when Katie was at Red Lodge or when she was in Missoula?
Which came first? I feel like I met you in Missoula.
Yeah, I think we met in Missoula. I was in Red Lodge first, but just
okay.
I was in Red Lodge in 2011, 2012, and then I moved to Missoula.
Okay.
And just thinking about, because I feel like I met you in 2011, right when you were, or 2012, right when you were at the Bray,
Okay.
or yeah, I don't actually, I can't quite remember, but you were in Montana, that maybe back. And so I've
Yeah.
been able to like watch your career trajectory and just kind of take note about like what you were doing and how you were moving around and how you were navigating everything. And that sense of community is really important. I feel like for the past 10 years, I've been able to like move somewhere and be put immediately into a community because of Clay.
Mm-hmm.
And now in New York, I've had to work a little bit harder for that. And BKLYN CLAY has been a big part of that community. But I completely understand what you're talking about, just like wanting to be able to have those friends nearby. And as an artist, you do spend a lot of time alone.
Right. Yeah, it's a really difficult
Can you guys
thing.
hear?
I think there's some people that fantasize about being in their studio all day by themselves, and I'm like, okay, 6 hours, I'm done. I got to get back to like people or, doing something else. And so, I kind of had like, after I left the Bray, and went to Sacramento, I kind of had this weird, like, I think what it was is I hated my life all of a sudden. I kind of hated the fact that I traveled so much. I was exhausted. I kind of had this moment where I realized like I didn't want to do it anymore. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm really unhappy and this is fucking killing me, is basically what I thought. And I had a similar year, the following year, planned exactly the same. And I was like, I have to change something. And so I actually started doing a lot. I realized at that point that I had sort of put myself and my self-care at the bottom of my to-do list. And I needed to put myself on top and say, okay, you need to set some guidelines. You need to like eat better. You need to start working out. You need to have regular 8-hour work days. You need to not, I just needed to really reprioritize my life and make myself a little bit happier. And so I think the pendulum swung back to kind of a much more reasonable expectation. I think sometimes as artists, we can think we have to work so hard to kind of make things work that nobody ever helps us like figure out how to stop working and sort of stop hustling for that. And that, maybe you should go for a walk or go for a bike ride, or take some time for yourself, cook yourself a meal. It's like, I think we just, we forget that this is in service of having a rich and full life. And if your life is only like your art, it may not be so full. It just may not be as rounded out or as sustainable as having some diversity in your life.
That's so interesting, because I feel like sometimes an outside perspective, if you're not an artist or understand what a studio practice is, people kind of think that you having a studio practice is your self-care.
Right.
And it's actually work. It's not like, yes, everyone loves their studio, hopefully a bit, but it's work and it takes a lot of energy, and it takes, like, sometimes you hate it and everyone's like, oh, you get to work all day in clay, it must be so relaxing. I'm like, no, this is a battle.
That is like my biggest, it's such a difficult thing, because I know that it's certain people's dream. I mean, that's the thing. It comes from this place of envy where they just like, I just want to be able to do that too. And, but yeah, there's never that understanding really of, I remember one time I was at the Bray and it was like Friday night. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was working, glazing pots. I was just like working for a deadline. And all of a sudden the lights came on in the hall and there were these strangers like doing a tour in the middle of the night. And they came to my door and they're like, oh my God, you're so lucky. You must be so happy you're here. I was like, it's Friday night at 11 o'clock. No, I'm not happy that I'm here. Get out of here. What are you doing? It's just like, what is happening right now? So it's that interesting thing of, no, I'm working at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. It's like, it may not look like work to you, but it is work, so.
Sunshine, when you started, did you have like dreams of being a potter in the woods? Because like I was so convinced that it was just going to be like fun, and it would be like me just like having a great time in the woods, making pots.
You know what's funny is I never had any vision of that particularly. I had more of a vision of, I was actually just following this passion and skill that I had. Like I kept kind of walking down this road of like, I kind of, because I think when I started down this trajectory, I was in college and I was like, oh, these two people that are my professors are making a living doing this. Maybe that's something I could do. That was kind of the impetus for that. It's like, and I come from California. There's, you know, there's lots of woods, but they're nowhere near where I lived. So that was not the model that I saw. So I think I thought I would become a teacher in a more traditional sense. But I really just had this idea that I wanted to make spirited work. Like I loved being in the studio all the time in the beginning and just working towards improving my craft, basically, you know.
Yeah.
Would you mind just talking about why you were traveling so much
Yeah, so during my right before, so basically 2011, 2012, I did a conference called the Utilitarian Clay Conference in Tennessee at Airmont. And that was like 16 people. We were all doing functional work, and it was like a workshop sort of space, 3-day kind of intensive thing. And up until, like, I was really new out of school. I'd obviously been to a lot of like school workshops and things like that, seeing people demonstrate. It was not something I thought I would do because my process is so simple. And at that time, I really kind of viewed it as this kind of, oh, you got to have a shtick, you got to screen print, or you got to be able, you know, it's like you had something really kind of unique that you were doing. And I was just like, I'm pinching pots. That's not very exciting, you know? So when I went and did Utilitarian Clay, I had a lot of success. It was one of those things where I was like, I win, I did it. I just felt really like empowered. I was like, oh, I know how to do this, because it was interesting because it mostly was a lot of storytelling and talking and about why I made pots. And because my practice is so straightforward, I can explain it really in 2 minutes, that then we could talk about the whys and not the hows. And so from that, I got invited to do workshops sort of around the country. That was the beginning. So at the time I was sort of talking about, I was doing anywhere from 18 to 25 workshops a year. And that was a ton of travel. And I mean, basically, if you think if I'm doing a week-long workshop, that's at least a week of time away in addition to a couple days of prep. If I'm doing a weekend workshop, that's still about 5 days, you know, like of prep and being away. So it was just, I was away a lot and traveling a lot. And so I'm really grateful for that, but it ended up being kind of this, you know, when you're first coming into like trying to have a career, you just say yes to everything. You're like, yes, of course. Yes, of course. You know, you kind of just, you're afraid of saying no to anything. And so, yeah, that was sort of why I, you know, like that pushed me to this kind of very different career trajectory because of the lack of sort of teaching, like institutional teaching jobs, and the skill that I had to workshop.
Okay, yeah. That, I mean, workshops, I feel like are a main source of income for ceramic artists.
Yeah.
If you're not traditionally teaching, but I've been told it's exhausting. I've never done one, but.
Yeah. I think it's hard because if you think, like I love, any of you guys are familiar with Karen Kuntz's work. She's a wood print artist out of Nebraska. I remember her saying this, like when she was building her studio, that when you're workshopping, you're going and investing in other people's communities and you're not investing in your own, right? And so when you think of it that way of like, oh, how do you pull back? Like you're kind of, you know, I'm more of an introvert. I always think it's funny when I go workshop, I realize that I haven't been talking near as much because my voice goes away. Like all of a sudden I'm like hoarse and I've got to drink tea with honey. I'm just like, because I don't talk that much. And it's very performative and very entertaining. And it's basically like being a cheerleader. You're cheerleading people and, you know, really trying to pack as much into that time you have with them. And so I think it's a really enriching and wonderful experience. But I think that was the thing too. I would have these moments where I didn't understand why I was so exhausted. You know, I would go do a 2-week workshop and then I would lay on the sofa when I got home and eat popsicles for 3 days. Like I just didn't like, I was like, I don't know what to, like, I was so depleted. And my friend Ernie said, he was like, well, Sunshine, you're an introvert. Like that idea that like that experience doesn't fill me up. It pulls a lot of energy. And I've learned to set much better boundaries with that. Like, I think kind of, in the clay world, you can be pushed to be an extrovert. Like, okay, you got to come out after dinner and have a couple beers and do, like, you have to do all these things. And I've learned to be like, after dinner, I go back to my room so that I can be fresh and awake the next day at 8 a.m. to be on, to be available to people, right? So I've had to learn some of those skills because it wasn't, because, you know, you sort of see other people doing it. And I have friends that those experiences just fill them up and fill them full of energy. And for me, that's a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And Sunshine, can you talk about the book that you wrote?
Oh, yeah.
So I wrote a book. So it is basically, that came about because Ben Carter wrote a book on throwing, and we were at a opening one night and we were talking and he was like, do you ever write? I was like, well, only if I have to, you know. I kind of was like, no, not really. But he was like, are you interested in writing a hand building book? Because my publisher is looking for somebody to do kind of a sister book to the throwing book. And I was like, well, at the moment I was like, I really would love to try something else and have a new kind of challenge. And so he put me in contact with them. I did a writing sample and came up with an outline. And so from a year to that, I had a book. So that was kind of this crazy thing. So
that's fast.
It was really fast. Yeah. So I think that's the key, is like having deadlines and an editor. Like they had kind of had the whole format laid out because they wanted it to kind of mirror Ben's book a bit. So we kind of had it all kind of planned out. And so I had a lot of freedom to kind of come up with my own kind of chapter outline and what I felt was important content, and then also like who I included in the book, all that kind of stuff, was an interesting, and part of this, I really wanted to learn about the publishing world and what that was like. You know, I don't think I would have ever on my own written a how-to book. That part was actually really difficult. Most of that stuff was, I would have to dictate like while I was doing it, to have somebody type it out, and then I'd sort of re-edit it, and then my editor would edit it. So I tended to, you know, like different things were like the chapter that I really liked was about developing content, this idea of how, you know, those types of things, like that was more interesting to me than sometimes the how-to stuff. But that was what they were after, because it's kind of a newer, it's like a resurgence of craft books that they were kind of looking to put out. So, and that's why like Forrest has a book now, and Lindsay Osterrider has a book. And those are two people that I recommended to do books, because I was like, you know, they're both doing different things and are interesting, you know, artists in our field right now. So,
were there any books that you looked at or that you do look at kind of for inspiration for when you were writing yours? Because I know there are particular books that I find really helpful for.
Right. You know what's interesting is I didn't actually do a lot of research on what was, because, you know, when I spoke to my editor and their vision for this book, it made me realize like the audience for my book is not the 5,000 people that we see at NCECA. That's not the audience. The audience is the bottom of the craft pyramid of people that don't have access to a studio, that they're going to do it at their kitchen table kind of thing, like just a craft kind of audience. And so it was meant to be like, you know, compared to like say Clary Ilian's book or something, it was much more meant to give people a toehold into working with clay. That was very not meant to be like a master level kind of idea. And so that really changed my perspective on it too, because I think it's different to write a book for our audience versus a much more general kind of population, because you're going to speak to them very differently about, you know, it's like, it's kind of in a weird way, it's like my workshops. I'll have people that have been in clay 20 years and I'll have someone that's never touched clay before. And so how do you talk to both those people and help them, you know? And so I think that was how I approached it. It was much more the sort of straightforward kind of talking to a layperson kind of idea.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Along with the book, you create tools.
I do. Passive revenue streams, you guys, you gotta have them. Yeah, so the tools basically come from workshopping. Like I have particular tools that are my favorite. They're kind of basic, but then they're not available in stores. So I have Troy Bungard makes most of my wood tools, and then I have a couple other things that I source different places, and then I sell tools. And a lot of that just came from selling tools at workshops, and now I sell them on my website. So
I just got to talk with Julie Moon a couple days ago, and she was talking about how she sort of has like broken up her studio into different sections of like doing fabrication, doing like small run production, and then jewelry, and then her own work, and sort of having all these different like revenue streams, but also just like ways to kind of break up what she's working on at current times. And do you think that's where some of this, like wanting to do a book and then wanting to make tools?
Well, I think what's interesting is when we are navigating the world as a studio potter, like that looks different. Like I think it used to be people in the woods and they would sell pots to their local people. Our local woods is the United States. Like that is our local market. Like if, like for me, I moved around for like 10 years. I would live 2 years at a place or 3 years at a place like this. And so that's what's crazy. It's like, I realized when I got out of grad school that my local, I was never going to have this local market that, you know, they kind of would push, like the old timers would push in this way. And I hate to say old timers, whatever, but a previous generation that would push this idea of like, yeah, build a chicken coop and make pots in it and become like, be your local potter. And I was like, that's not my world. I'm not going to buy property. Like, I mean, it's part of the reason I moved to like an electric kilns. Like I used to do a lot of wood fire, but I'm like, I'm never going to build a property, have property to build a kiln on. And I'm not going to, how do I rely on a group of people to firework and then try to sell that as my living? Like it just didn't feel quite right. And so I think I'm really lucky to have had kind of more of an entrepreneurial family. Like we owned our own small business. And so I kind of understood what a retail market looked like and what that meant. And I have learned through the course of my career that, you know, I think that's like coming back to what Katie and I were talking about, this idea of your studio practice is your job. So the reality is like the time in the studio that I spend is minimal compared to being online. It's like I'm answering emails, I am having chats with people, I am setting up workshops, I am selling tools, I'm printing labels. Like I'm basically working from my computer the majority of the time. Like this last making session I had, I actually gave myself 2 months to make, where I went to the studio for at least 6 hours a day for 5 days in a row, like a typical kind of work week idea. And that's the first time I've done that in years. I normally am like maybe a couple days a week, I'll do something, but it's not like I go to the studio every day. That's the, you know, I kind of learned, like when I was first starting out of grad school, I kind of set, I'm a big goal setter. So I you know, I think, and I come from this idea of entrepreneurship where you have to do the math and understand how much it costs to make a living. Like, what do you need to make a living? What do you need? What does that translate into the objects that you sell? And that was a lot of my time at the Bray, where I'm like, I am working the hardest I will ever work, and I'm not getting by. I'm barely scratching the surface of survival. How do I change that? And so I set a lot of goals for that. You know, it's like, that was the year that I was like, okay, if I sell my mugs for $50 or whatever it was at the time, and I want to make $20,000 a year. Okay, how many mugs is that? And that was the idea of like, at the time I was selling all this work through galleries, and I was like, okay, well, if I sell 500 mugs myself, that's a $20,000 base income. Anything else is above that. Okay, so that meant I made 500 mugs in January. And I figured out how to like sell those to become, you know, and also like what that translates to galleries is like, well, I have to make 1,000 mugs to make the same income minus shipping. Like that doesn't even count shipping, right? So I do a lot of that kind of reverse engineering of like, okay, if I want this to be my base income, what do I have to do to make that happen? And so it's like, it's really strange. I know that it breaks up our days and all these other things, but it's funny because I think the tool thing has been really important in this time right now, because I also pay someone to make them. So he gets income from it. I can sell it to people. They also are able to make stuff at home with it. You know, so I think there's a service quality to it too. But yeah, I always think that the funny thing about being an artist is most of your time's not spent being an artist. You know, it's kind of this different perspective of being a business person. So
I can remember, I don't know, Gus, if you were there for this when in Montana, Julie Galloway gave a lecture probably in 2013. And that was the first time I had heard about like that idea of reverse engineering, how much work you needed to make in order to like reach a goal. And so she would be like, okay, I want to go skiing. That's one teapot for one day. And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, this makes complete sense. Like, that's how you have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember that, but I do remember just like the first person that I knew of that was sort of trying to find new paths to sell their work was Ayumi Horie, and she was sort of, seemed like she was the first one that was like really pushing this, like selling through her website online. But Sunshine, it seemed like you, and I even just remember it from when I was in undergrad and you came as a visiting artist, I felt like you were sort of also like at the forefront of just trying to navigate different ways to move your work.
Well, yeah, I think it was like, it was necessity, right? I think most of us came from institutions, like especially 10 to 15 years ago, that like my teachers didn't have websites. Like no, you know, like they just didn't quite understand, like, you know, the professional practices was about making a resume and an artist statement. It wasn't about how to sell work. And those are different things. Like learning to become an artist and a maker is different than becoming a business person, right? But that's one of those things where you dump a lot of people into a space, like, and there's only a limited number of jobs as teachers. You're not really training people to be teachers. So how do you navigate that? And when I went to the Bray, you know, most people go to institutions like the Bray or residencies with artistic goals in mind. My proposal was all business oriented. It was about, how do I survive? How do I make this happen? Like I need to figure out if I can actually take my skills and turn it into a career without an institution. And that was, and so that's what I pushed for. But even then, when I did my like intake interview with Steve, you know, I sort of revered Steve as like, oh, he's kind of like your boss. And I just had this like real respect for him. And we were doing this intake, you know, interview. And I was really like, I've got to figure out how to do these things. And like, I was really business minded. And I remember Steve saying, oh yeah, I don't have a website. I should really get on that. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? I was like, you were supposed to be a leader in this industry. You don't have a website? That is unacceptable. And I was like, oh, that just came out of my mouth. I was just like, but I was like, my reaction to that. And he had a website by the end of the month, just so you know. Because I was just like, this is like the world that we're living in. How do we model for people how to have a career if all you teach them to do is build a kind of an irrelevant resume? That doesn't really, you know, it's like, oh, you need all these shows. Do you really? No, I don't know that that's what you need to do. Like, how do you, because I remember I was really lucky in that funny way of, I was getting all these invitations to do workshops like really early on because of that initial, like I just had I developed a following of people interested in seeing me work. And I was able to capitalize that and say, yes, of course, I'll come do that thing. And I had fellow peers who were just like, how are you getting these workshops? And I was like, well, I'm invited, which is really lucky, but you can also propose to do this thing, right? I think we have to really, entrepreneurship is scary if you approach it as an artist and not a business person, right? You kind of have to put on a very different hat to be a business person and have less of your feelings involved. You know, I think that's the thing. We're sort of trained to be able to tap into our emotions and our creativity in this sort of safe space. And business is full of rejection, you know, and I think we have to figure out how to navigate that and put on a different kind of, develop a different skill set to find our way in that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was answering the question. I feel like it went on a crazy tangent.
No, I mean, like, I'm just trying to think back when I was in undergrad, which is when you were at the Archie Bray, and it did seem like you really, and it probably felt different for you, but it seemed like you really sort of like established yourself like very quickly as whatever it is that you are.
No, I totally did, and I pushed the people around me, because I think even Giselle now, she like references me as her like, you know, business guru kind of thing, where I'm just like, no, just do this thing, because it was a chance and an opportunity where we could workshop ideas around each other, like, hey, I'm going to try this thing, what do you think? Like, we had more of a water cooler kind of business situation where we were all making great work, but how do you get it out into the world? And so I felt really lucky to have people to bounce ideas off of. And I also kind of have my spirit is to just jump in the deep end, just like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. And I very much will try things without having tested it or worried about it or thought it through completely, because I'm like, well, let's see if I like doing it or if it's a feasible thing. And so I'm able to sort of pivot and change and shift according to what I'm interested in, but also what services me, services others. Like, I kind of will navigate those things really quickly. And I think it's like, I always think it's funny because I am more introverted by nature, but I wanted to have a career in ceramics, right? And that I realized early on, like, I would used to go to art shows and I'd kind of walk through, see the art, and then I'd leave. I wouldn't talk to anybody. But when I made the decision to like try to have a career in ceramics, I was like, okay, Sunshine, you have to like go to these shows, and then you have to talk to two people you don't know. Like, that was like, like learning, like forcing myself to network. It was like, I wanted to have a career in ceramics enough that I was willing to change my behavior, right? And I think that's the key. It's like, if you want to have a career, you have to figure out how to change your behavior to suit that. Like, the career is not going to change for you. You have to first sort of navigate. And I think we're in different waters now where the world has shifted and changed, and even more so now, of like, you have to understand what your skills are, like that they're not just pinching clay, right? Like, for me, my skills aren't just I know how to make a pot. It's about how I can talk to people, how I can inspire people, how I can navigate the business world in some fashion. Like, I don't think I'm ultra successful by any means, but I do work within a realm that I'm comfortable, and I understand what I offer to people and what I can, and then I, you know, check in with my own kind of compass of what I think is okay to do. And I think sometimes that limits me more than anything is like my own, like, willingness to participate in particular things, you know? Yeah, so that's kind of like, I think of a career like that of, you know, I think in school, we're kind of molded to think about our, like, I've never felt more selfish in my life than when I was in grad school, because all you're doing is thinking about yourself and your emotions and how to communicate all that stuff. And then, you know, it doesn't, and so then you come out of school kind of like really full of your identity, and you want that to be solid, when I think it takes a lot of flexibility to navigate the world and other people and other situations, right? But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that.
Do you see a difference between your studio practice and your workshops? I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, but like the work that you make in your studio different from the work you're making during the workshops? Do you understand what I'm trying to ask? Like,
well, no,
like,
that...
is it your work? Is it your work that you're making at the workshops? Is the workshop your work? I don't know.
In that way, like, I remember one of the first workshops I ever organized was when I was a student at Sacramento State, and I had Krista Assad come, and I was just so enamored with her. I just thought she was a rock star. And, you know, we kind of, whatever, I was like the student responsible for giving her check, you know, from the student body or whatever. And so, but it was interesting, like, she said something that sort of stuck with me, is that the workshop, or the money that I make at the workshop, pays for the work at the workshop. Like, it's not like, it's those, to me, I look as teaching tools. Like, they are learning instruments for the students. I think when I think about what I bring to a workshop, you know, it's much more interactive. It's about who I am. I mean, I always feel like that way in teaching anyways. If I'm teaching a beginning clay class, I mean, I learned this at Utah State. I'm not teaching them beginning clay. I'm exposing them to a completely different idea about how to live life and the choices that we make, right? And Utah was unique that way because this was all a student body that were gonna be 19 and get married, and they didn't have exposure to this, an alternative idea of what your life could be, right? They were on a pretty straight trajectory towards family and that type of stuff. And that was fine, but it was interesting for them to be exposed to someone like me who never got married, who having children wasn't a priority, but following my passion and being an artist was a priority. Like those kinds of things. That's what I actually shared with them, was like, oh, people make different choices. And so often when I'm at workshops, I do feel that I am sharing my life experience, my attitude towards clay, like how I choose to, I do share that idea of like my studio practice. I try to emulate that for people, and that it doesn't have to be this kind of serious thing, because that's important to me. Is like I make from a place of joy and happiness. And so I'm not a kind of tortured artist in that way. And I do what works. I don't like, when my teacher told me to do this thing, I was like, why? If it doesn't work for you, don't do it. Like, you know, I think I always look at what I am helping people do in a workshop is connect to their creativity. That's my goal in that. And I think because a lot of that population are people that sort of set down their creativity to have a career and have a family and do a different thing. And they're later in life sometimes trying to pick that back up, but they don't have the confidence in that yet to like be bold. And so my goal is to always just give them permission to be bold and to trust themselves. Typically that's my underlying goal, is like, they're never going to make a garlic bug. They don't care. Like, it's just like, it's a dumb thing that, you know, that they think is why they took the workshop. But I'm like, no, it's going to be this other thing that I have an agenda. I totally do.
That's great. Well, Sunshine, do you want to, you grabbed some pots?
I did. I randomly grabbed some pots. I did look around this morning and I was like, I don't even know what to talk about. So I did grab things. So I got this one. It's full of fruit. It's a Nick Danielson fruit basket, which I think is lovely. I know, they're so great. I love this like funky kind of tealy blue, pale. It's really pale. I love that. So that's a really nice one. Like the reality is like I have so many pots.
Yeah.
I love bandana pottery. I have quite a few of there. That's the thing I always find, if I really like a potter, I have multiple pieces versus like one piece, right? So this one has all my kitty ashes in it. This is I keep it in my bedroom with all my little past babies that I had. So, but I always thought it was so sweet because it's like a little spirit goat kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then I grabbed this guy. This was one of those John Gill.
Oh, nice.
Like a chutney bowl. It's like got kitten toys in it. But yeah, sometimes I put a plant in it. It's just a beautiful thing. I just don't know that I would ever have this much chutney in my life. So I don't know.
That was a chutney bowl?
Yeah, that's a chutney bowl. And then I have this beautiful Zemmer Palad piece that I think is lovely.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I actually have to get a new little thing because in the move, like it busted the little jar, so I've got to get a new little jar. But yeah, so those are the things that I pulled out to share with you. They just bring me joy in some fashion, and you know, I always think of the pots that I have a lot of pots out in my space. So, but I think from our previous conversation, you can see like plants have kind of taken over. So I keep moving the pots back to put more plants in places. So that's kind of how I'm operating.
Yeah, roughly how many plants do you think you're up to now?
I have over 100. I haven't counted since it hit that mark. I was like, triple digits, Sunshine, you're crazy.
You could start selling plants now.
I know, exactly. I know. But yeah, and it's been fun because I've been making these little planters to go with stuff. Like this is a little planter I made. And just really playing around with kind of these new forms. It's been really kind of liberating and fun to make these. just because it's like such a, like, I don't know, I always like, I was teasing the other day, like I think of them as like pants for my plants. And so like, here's another one that I made, just like little fancy doodads, but they're also super simple. Like I just put a wash on them and throw them in the kiln, and they come out and are ready to go. So I love that.
I remember when you came to the University of Montana, I was really excited about your work and stuff, and I asked you about how you were getting low fire matte glazes, and you were like, oh, I sandblast them, and I was like, oh, I'll try that, and you were just like, it's not worth it, don't like
don't do it. Yeah. I know, I always say that. Everyone is so excited about the possibility of sandblasting, and they think it's miraculous, and I mean the reality is it provides a really beautiful surface, and I love that. But I'm always trying to, like, this past couple months, I've been working on all these pots for St. Croix, and I gave myself 2 months to make, a month to glaze and fire everything, and then a month to process, right? So I've spent the last month sandblasting, hand sanding, and oiling 450 pots. Like, geez, and I was just like, this is the part of it I wish I could get people to understand that is so tedious about it and so unpleasant. And it's because it's not a fun way to spend your time, you know? And so,
you like but have your hands in a sandblaster.
Yeah, and you're wearing like ear protection, and it's so noisy, and you're trying to, like, you're standing on one foot because you have the foot on the pedal, and it's just like, ugh. And you're like, I'm a shorter person, so I have to stand on a big crate to look in, and then it's cold there, and so the window's fogging up, and just like, oh, this is such a nightmare. So I'm always trying to discourage people, but everybody loves, you know. But it's funny, I taught a workshop last year in New Mexico, and they had a sandblaster, so everybody wanted to try. So we went and sandblasted, and I kind of warned them, like, oh, it's not very fun, it's not interesting, you know, it's like not that great, you're gonna hate doing it. And they would all do, like, they go shh, and they're like, this is amazing. And I was like, no, you got to finish sandblasting the pot. Like, you don't get to just do one little splash, you got to do the whole thing. And so then when I made them do the whole thing, they're like, that's not as much fun. Like, yeah. It's like, it's fine to just do the one thing, but imagine doing that for 4 hours. It's not that much fun. So I think that's why these little planters are kind of a relief. I'm kind of thinking of like sort of moving away from the sandblasted work and trying some new things for this next body of work. So we will see. I think it may just go so crazy simple where I'm just like rock clay and a clear liner. Like, we'll try that for a
while. We'll look out for it. Yeah. Katie, do you have anything else for Sunshine?
Oh yeah, I wanted to address one other thing, because I know that you are an incredible knitter. So I kind of wanted to talk about that in relationship to your studio or not studio, or how you look at your knitting.
Yeah.
Are you wearing something you knit?
I am. I knit this. I actually knit this when I was at Anderson Ranch for like a 3-week workshop. So it's like
you taught all day, and then you just like were sitting there and you did the entire shawl in 3 weeks.
Exactly.
Not productive.
Well, I always think of you guys know Nick Offerman. Did you watch his like American Man or American something? Anyways, it's like, get a hobby, people. What the hell, you know? And think of your hobby more as a vocation, right? I think when I was going through grad school, I took up printmaking at the same time. And the printmaking had no, like, my instructors would be like, Sunshine, don't you have things you should be doing? And I was like, you're not the boss of me. I was like, I can do this thing. And because it was like, there was no pressure on it. It was just pure creativity and fun. And like, okay, I can have an outlet that isn't full of all of this angst and kind of insanity. So I did have a friend once tell me that I would be really handy to have as a friend in an apocalypse, because I can like cook and knit and sew and do all these other things. They're like, Jesus. So I do have a lot of like, what's that?
We're in it right now.
So we are. I was like, oh yeah, it's so good. But yeah, so the knitting kind of came about. Actually, Linda Arbuckle. I'd learned to knit when I was working as a nanny, because the kids I was taking care of were going to transition into Waldorf school. And in Waldorf, like kindergarten, they learn to knit. It's like a hand coordination skill that they're learning. And so the summer before, I was like, well, why don't I just buy a knitting book and we'll learn how to knit. So I was teaching little 5-year-olds how to knit. And so my knitting consisted basically of scarves and hats. And I went to the Pentaculum that Jason Burnett hosted at Aramont. And Linda Arbuckle was there, and she was really big into knitting socks. And so she was like, Sunshine, you should try it. Buy a book. This is the book I recommend. And that kind of set me on this course of becoming more of a knitter, and just developing my pattern skills. Like I had more of a maturity to do it, and patience. And it's also like, it's interesting, you know, I always think tactily, clay is so hard, because while it's fun to pinch and mess with clay, the glazing process is so difficult. All this, like, to achieve color and like the final result is not necessarily as tangible and as practical as, like, I bought gray yarn and I made a gray sweater. Like, that is kind of, you know, I made it into a garment. So there's something really satisfying about doing that. And it's so funny because I am not, I just will randomly sign up for things. So like I follow all these knitters on Instagram, and like I'll sign up to be a test knitter, where like I'll take their pattern and then I'll test knit it and sort of, you know, give them feedback on that. So it's just become more of a hobby that I like to do. And I really like the process of learning something new each time I sort of do a pattern. And it's also really kind of satisfying to like take yarn and turn it into a garment. It's like crazy that we can do that. It just kind of is shocking to me, but it's like, you know, it's just an ancient skill, but I still like that I can do it. But well, I do think it's not related to like my, it's not really related to my studio practice. I think it's more, I always think of this, like I like that during that time I was telling you where I was questioning what I was doing with clay. I kind of had this identity crisis, like, well, who is Sunshine Cobb if she doesn't do clay? Like, I felt a big part of my identity was going to disappear if I chose to go a different direction. And during that time, I really thought about what was important about my studio practice, and like how that fed into my identity. And I think I really came to the conclusion that I'm a maker at heart. I'm always making something. So if I'm sewing or building a garden box, like I like to make things, and I'm like the ultimate DIYer, right? It's just like, I'm going to do it myself. Or like, even like people have been going like, where'd you get your hair cut? And I was like, oh, I'm just doing it myself. Like, I'm just like going to do this thing, right? I'm like not going to worry about it. And you know, because to me, I always outline like worst possible scenarios. I'll just have to have a shaved head. Like, I'll be basically worst scenario. But so yeah, that's the thing. I think of it more in terms of, I just like to be creative, and that can sometimes be following someone else's pattern or making up my own, you know, but there's a lot less pressure, I think, on some of the hobbies that I have, that I can just push through. Right. And it's not actually work, right? People are like, oh, you should sell those. I was like, I don't want to make it work, because when work happens, then all this other stuff happens. And, you know, that can be challenging. So I just like to make stuff, really. I don't know, you know.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I actually bought some apocalyptic yarn to make a sweater. So I've been working on a new sweater. So. But yeah, and it's funny, like moving to Montana has me, like, I haven't made socks in forever, but it's like, it's just the place for sweaters, man. I think part of the reason I moved back was so I could wear all my knitwear.
That's amazing.
California, it doesn't make sense to have so many sweaters. So.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome. I know, I was trying to think, what other questions haven't we covered?
Oh, well, I think you should definitely, what's the title of your book, and like what?
Oh yeah, it's Mastering Hand Building Tips and Tricks or something like that. But yeah, if you have that, you can get it anywhere books are sold, or I have them on my website also. And I've got tools on my website. And then also like the workshop stuff that I've been doing, like I've been hosting those. We haven't really talked about that at all. But yeah, I've just been hosting the workshops on Saturdays. I'm taking this Saturday off, but just sort of kitchen table projects. That's kind of how I've been framing that, because like so many people are at home and don't have access to studios right now and need a little bit of inspiration or just something to do that feels normal a little bit, you know, so.
Yeah, so what's the best way to find those? Is it on your website or?
If you go to my website under the lessons area, yeah, next week's will be about vase forms, like altering thrown forms, but also like coil building bases or, you know, slab building bases, thinking about those kinds of ideas, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
But they're also like, I have also been posting all of that stuff, the sort of Zoom classes on my YouTube channel. So if you can't afford to come to the live class, then you can still watch it on YouTube for the time being, so.
It's such an amazing resource, your website.
Thanks. Yeah, I try to have it be something. I actually have to rework it for the St. Croix tour because it's not really meant to have 500 pots on it, so I've got to like refigure that out. So
what are the dates of that again?
So that's Mother's Day weekend. So I think it's the 8th, 9th, and 10th or something like that. So
okay, yeah.
Awesome.
Well, that will be a new experience for everyone.
That will be. I actually was, a friend of mine was saying it might be really cool. Like, you know, I was sort of thinking like, oh, we're not going to have kind of the sale. But the reality is like now everybody can go. Like really, like all the people that weren't going to be able to travel there anyways, now have access to all those beautiful pots that everybody's been working on for a year, you know, basically. So yeah. I think it'll be really exciting that way if people are buying pots and can afford to do that right now. So it'd be great.
Oh, that's so cool.
But I also love it. It's like getting a lot of the old timers online. Like half of them don't have websites. So it's like they've all had to scramble and build websites and do all that stuff. So I'm like, all right, 2020, new challenges. Like, so.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for doing this, Sunshine, and for donating to the bingo.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope that goes great. I'm excited to sort of check it out tonight. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you guys.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye. You too. Thanks everybody that was here.